There's a moment in a small hunter-gatherer camp, sometime in the deep past when everyone already knows. Nobody says it out loud yet, but the whispers have started. The sideways glances, the quiet decision not to let him hunt alone with anyone anymore. Because this isn't the first time, it's the third, maybe the fourth. And there's no police to call, no jail cell waiting somewhere down the road, no trial with a judge and a jury and a verdict read aloud in a courtroom. There's just 30 or 40 people, tightly bound together by survival, who now have to decide what to do about the most dangerous person they know, using only what they have. Here's the question almost nobody asks about ancient life. Not how did they hunt, not how did they build shelter, not how did they survive the winter. What did they do when the threat wasn't outside the camp, but inside it? What happened when a group of early humans realized they were living alongside someone who killed again and again and showed no sign of stopping? The story most people carry around goes something like this. Ancient life was already so violent, so brutal, so soaked in casual bloodshed that a repeat killer wouldn't have stood out at all. Just another dangerous person in a dangerous world. No concept of justice, no shared moral code, just chaos managed by whoever happened to be strongest that week. That story is wrong in a way that should genuinely surprise you. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm spent decades studying this exact question, examining ethnographic records from dozens of hunter-gatherer societies across the globe, from the Arctic to the Kalahari to the Amazon, looking for patterns in how these groups actually handled their most dangerous members. What he found wasn't chaos. It was something closer to the opposite. A consistent, deliberate, and remarkably sophisticated system of justice, operating without writing, without courts, and without anyone you'd recognize as a police officer, that nonetheless managed to identify, judge, and eliminate the most persistently violent people in the community. And here's the detail that should stop you. Boehm's research found that among the offenses that most consistently triggered this kind of ultimate punishment, execution, the single most common category wasn't political rivalry or personal grudges. It was exactly what you'd expect from a modern true crime documentary. Repeat killers. People who had murdered more than once, who showed a pattern rather than a single act of passion or self-defense, who the group came to recognize as a persistent, unpredictable danger to everyone around them. Alongside them, in Boehm's data sat a second category that might surprise you just as much. People believed to practice malicious sorcery against others. Individuals seen as using hidden, unpredictable power to harm the group from within. Different mechanism in the group's understanding, same underlying fear. Someone dangerous, someone you couldn't see coming, someone the normal rules didn't seem to restrain. So what did the group actually do? The process Boehm documented was nothing like a spontaneous mob descending on someone in a fit of rage. It was, in almost every recorded case, deliberate, discussed, and agreed upon before anyone acted. This is one of the most important details in the entire body of research. A member of the group couldn't simply decide on their own that someone deserved to die and act on that belief. There had to be something close to consensus first. Quiet conversations between elders and respected hunters. A slow accumulation of shared certainty that this person, and not some other unlucky target of gossip or rivalry, was genuinely, repeatedly dangerous. Once that consensus formed, the actual killing tended to follow one of a small number of patterns. Sometimes a single individual, often a close relative of the condemned person, was quietly designated as the executioner, someone whose relationship to the killer meant the act wouldn't spiral into a new cycle of revenge between unrelated families. That person would carry out the killing alone, frequently by ambush, catching the target off guard rather than risking an open confrontation with someone already known to be capable of serious violence. Other times, the group acted together, a coordinated physical attack carried out collectively, spreading responsibility across many hands rather than resting it on one person's shoulders. And in some documented cases, an individual would take matters into their own hands first, and only afterward would the community formally approve of what had already been done, retroactively converting a personal act into a sanctioned one. What all three methods share is something researchers studying this behavior consider genuinely unique to humans. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, do engage in lethal violence against members of rival groups, and occasionally within their own communities. But that violence tends to be less planned, less coordinated, and dramatically less deliberate than what anthropologists observe in human execution patterns. A chimpanzee attack on another chimpanzee is closer to an eruption. A human execution in the societies Boehm studied is closer to a decision. Someone made a case, others weighed it. A consensus formed, then and only then did the killing happen. Researchers studying the evolution of this behavior have a name for it: targeted conspiratorial killing. And the emphasis on conspiratorial matters enormously. This wasn't rage, it was coordination. A specific individual, identified, discussed, and agreed upon, eliminated through planning rather than passion. As far as we can currently tell, that specific combination, targeting a single individual through group agreement rather than open combat, doesn't appear in any other species on the planet. Not chimpanzees, not any other primate. It appears to be something genuinely, distinctly human. Now, it's worth pausing here on something important, because this system only works, only stays fair, if there's some kind of protection against getting it wrong. And the ethnographic record suggests there was. The requirement for broad consensus before any execution wasn't just a formality. It was the actual safeguard against exactly the failure mode you'd expect. Someone using a false accusation to eliminate a rival, settle a grudge, or seize a mate or resource under the cover of righteous punishment. Because the decision required agreement across many people, often including individuals who had no personal stake in the outcome, a single liar or manipulator couldn't easily weaponize the system for personal gain. They would have needed to convince an entire coalition of largely unrelated people that their story held up, which is a far higher bar than convincing one angry husband or one resentful rival. This doesn't mean the system was perfect. Ethnographers have documented cases where accusations, particularly of sorcery, were almost certainly used opportunistically against unpopular or vulnerable individuals. But the structural requirement for wide agreement functioned as a real, meaningful check, one that a purely individual act of revenge simply doesn't have. Here's where the story gets even stranger, and where it stops being just about crime and punishment and starts being about why you're the kind of animal you are today. Boehm's broader argument, built across decades of research and laid out most fully in his work on the evolution of egalitarian behavior, is that this pattern of coordinated, group-approved killing didn't just punish individual offenders, it reshaped the entire social structure of early human groups, generation after generation. Before this kind of coordinated moral policing existed, Boehm argues, early human groups likely operated something like other primate societies, with a rough hierarchy where the most physically dominant, most aggressive individuals could bully, intimidate, and monopolize resources and mates through sheer force. Anyone who has watched footage of a chimpanzee troop has seen a version of this dynamic. The strongest individual tends to get what he wants and everyone else adjusts around him. But somewhere in deep human prehistory, that dynamic broke. And Boehm's hypothesis is that it broke specifically because groups developed the capacity to coordinate against their most dangerous members. Once a coalition of ordinary people could reliably identify an overly aggressive, domineering, or violently unpredictable individual and eliminate that person through planned, agreed upon action, something fundamental shifted. Being physically dominant stopped being a guaranteed path to power. It started being a liability. The strongest, most aggressive man in the group was no longer simply the man everyone had to accommodate. He was the man everyone was quietly watching. The man whose behavior, taken too far, could get him killed by his own people. Researchers refer to the resulting social structure as a reverse dominance hierarchy. Instead of power flowing downward from the strongest individual, it flowed upward from the collective group, which held ultimate authority over any single member, no matter how physically formidable that member might be. Boehm describes it as the pyramid of power turned upside down, with a politically united rank and file effectively dominating anyone who tried to behave like an alpha in the old primate sense. There's a wider evolutionary consequence to this that researchers describe as self-domestication, and it's worth sitting with for a moment because of how strange it sounds applied to your own species. When researchers use the word domestication about animals, they usually mean humans selectively breeding a species for tameness, docility, reduced aggression, physical traits that come bundled along with that calmer temperament. Some researchers studying human evolution argue that something functionally similar happened to us, except we did it to ourselves using exactly this mechanism. Generation after generation, individuals who couldn't control their aggression, who kept crossing lines that got them executed by their own communities, were removed from the gene pool by the very people they lived among. Meanwhile, individuals capable of cooperating, reading social situations correctly, and keeping their more dangerous impulses in check survived and reproduced at higher rates. Some researchers place the beginning of this self-domestication process at roughly 300,000 years ago, suggesting it has been quietly shaping human temperament for somewhere in the neighborhood of 12,000 generations. You are, in a very real biological sense, descended overwhelmingly from people who were good enough at cooperating and controlling themselves to avoid becoming the person the group eventually had to deal with. And this is where the repeat killer becomes so important to the whole story. He isn't a side note. He's arguably the clearest, most extreme test case for the entire system. If a group can successfully identify, build consensus around, and eliminate the single most dangerous, most unpredictable member of their community, using nothing but coordination and shared judgment, then that same coalition building capacity can be applied to smaller problems too. Bullying, hoarding of resources, attempts to dominate mates or food through intimidation rather than negotiation. Boehm's research suggests that many of these lesser offenses were managed through gossip, ridicule, ostracism, and the threat of banishment, forms of social pressure that worked precisely because everyone understood, somewhere in the back of their mind, what the group was capable of doing if pressure alone failed. Execution didn't need to happen often to shape behavior, it just needed to be possible and everyone needed to know it. There's a harder question sitting underneath all of this that deserves honest attention rather than a comfortable dismissal. Some researchers estimate that homicide rates in certain hunter-gatherer societies studied ethnographically were startlingly high by modern standards, driven substantially by exactly the kind of internal conflict this entire system was built to manage, which tells you something important. This wasn't a peaceful utopia where justice always worked smoothly and violence rarely happened. It was a genuinely difficult, high-stakes social problem, managed imperfectly by people doing the best they could with the tools available to them. The execution of a repeat killer wasn't a triumphant moment. It was very likely a grim, necessary, carefully considered last resort, arrived at only after less severe measures had already failed to change someone's behavior. It's also worth asking what happened to a group that got this wrong, in either direction, because the failure modes on both sides carried real cost. A group too quick to execute risked destroying the trust that held everyone together, punishing the innocent, or losing a skilled hunter or valuable member over a misunderstanding, weakening the very community the punishment was meant to protect. A group too slow, too reluctant to act against a genuine repeat threat risked exactly what you would expect. More deaths, a climate of fear settling permanently over camp life, other members quietly leaving to join safer groups, taking their skills, their knowledge, and their reproductive future with them. Groups that struck the right balance, accurate enough in their judgment, and decisive enough in their response would have simply outcompeted groups that didn't, generation after generation. That, ultimately, is how a behavior this specific and this costly gets built permanently into a species, not because any one execution felt good or righteous in the moment, but because groups that could handle this problem correctly survived. And groups that consistently handled it badly didn't. What makes this pattern so significant isn't that it was pleasant, it's that it was deliberate. It required something that no other primate on Earth appears capable of organizing. A coalition of unrelated, sometimes barely related individuals agreeing among themselves that one specific person represented a threat serious enough to justify the ultimate sanction, and then following through on that agreement together in a way designed specifically to avoid spiraling into further unstructured violence. That is, in a very real sense, one of the earliest forms of justice this planet has ever seen. Not written down, not codified into law, but structurally, functionally recognizable as the same basic process that still runs underneath every courtroom you've ever heard of. Evidence gathered informally through observation and gossip. A period of building consensus among people whose judgment the group trusts. A decision that requires agreement rather than the unilateral will of any single person. And finally, a sanctioned, deliberate action carried out specifically because the group, collectively, decided it was justified. You can see the shadow of this exact structure in a modern jury, 12 people who don't necessarily know each other well, brought together specifically to build consensus about guilt before any punishment is authorized. The parallel runs deeper than it might first appear. A jury deliberates precisely because a single person's judgment, however confident, isn't considered sufficient grounds for the most serious punishments a society can hand down. That principle, that consensus among relatively disinterested people is a necessary safeguard before acting against someone, is not a modern legal invention. It is, according to Boehm's research, one of the oldest continuously operating ideas in human social life, older than agriculture, older than cities, older than writing itself. You can also see it in the deep cultural fascination so many people have with true crime, an almost compulsive need to understand exactly what someone did, to weigh the evidence, to feel confident before passing any kind of judgment in your own mind, even from a position of complete safety on your couch. That impulse to gather the full story before condemning someone isn't a modern invention. It's an old, evolved caution built directly into how humans process danger from within their own community. A caution that once had to be exactly right, because getting it wrong meant either letting a genuine danger continue unchecked or destroying the wrong person and shattering the trust that held the entire group together. Every true crime documentary that walks you slowly through timeline, motive, and evidence before finally revealing what happened is, in a strange and very real way, replaying the exact deliberative process your ancestors depended on for their own survival. The next time you find yourself unable to look away from a case, needing to know every detail before you'll allow yourself an opinion about what should happen to someone, you're not indulging some strange modern obsession. You're running an ancient piece of software built by small groups of people who once had to get this exact judgment right with nothing but their own careful observation and each other's trust because there was no one else coming to handle it for them. The camp is quiet again now. The decision has been made, carried out, and absorbed into the group's memory. The kind of story that gets told quietly for years afterward, shaping how the next generation understands what the community will and won't tolerate. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody needed to. It became part of what everyone simply knew about how the world worked, passed forward the way all the most important lessons were, until eventually, tens of thousands of years later, it became something you'd recognize instantly. A courtroom, a jury, a verdict, the same basic human impulse, running in an unbroken line back to a group of people who once had no other choice but to figure out justice for themselves.